A high-ranking cardinal loses his appeal on charges of sex abuse, and this week marks 1 year since Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano issued his stunning testimony. The papal posse, Robert Royal and Father GERALD Murray, are here with analysis. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. A great show for you tonight. Robert Royal and Father GERALD Murray are straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. But first, some breaking news. Australian Cardinal George Pell has lost the appeal of his conviction on charges of sex abuse. The 78-year-old former Vatican finance chief was ordered on Wednesday to serve out the rest of his 6-year sentence in a maximum security prison. A panel of judges ruled 2-1 to uphold Pell's conviction for sexually abusing 2 choir boys in his diocesan cathedral over 20 years ago. The cardinal issued a statement maintaining his innocence and his intention to appeal the decision to the Australian Supreme Court. Cardinal Pell is the highest-ranking Catholic cleric ever imprisoned for sexual abuse of minors. The Vatican acknowledged the court's decision in their own statement on Wednesday, expressing solidarity with victims, but also noting Pell's right to further appeal. The Holy See has suspended a church investigation until Pell has exhausted all chances to appeal his sentence. We'll continue to monitor this story. This week marks the anniversary of the stunning testimony of former papal nuncio to the U.S., Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano. He caused shockwaves in August of 2018 when he accused various hierarchs, including Pope Francis, of looking the other way and even covering up the sexual misdeeds of former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, as well as others. Now, since then, the crisis has continued to deepen all over the world. But has Vigano, a year later, been disproven or vindicated? Joining me with analysis of all of this and more is the papal posse. Editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, here in studio, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father GERALD Murray, joins us from Manhattan. Thank you both for being here. Now, a year ago, Archbishop Vigano, the former nuncio to the U.S., wrote this 11-page testimony in which he claimed that several senior church officials, including the Pope, were informed of McCarrick's sexual misdeeds and of sanctions imposed upon him by Benedict XVI. We now know there were some kinds of personal sanctions imposed on McCarrick, but he ignored them. In his initial testimony, and there have been several since, Vigano writes, quote, "We must tear down the conspiracy of silence with which bishops and priests have protected themselves at the expense of the faithful, a conspiracy of silence that in the eyes of the world risks making the church look like a sect, a conspiracy of silence not so dissimilar from the one that prevails in the mafia," end quote. I want to remind all of us what the Pope's initial reaction to this testimony was. He said this during a flight from a papal visit. Watch. "I read that statement this morning. I read it, and I will say sincerely that I must say this to you and all of you who are interested. Read the document carefully and judge it for yourselves. I will not say one word on this. I think the statement speaks for itself, and you have sufficient journalistic capacity to reach your own conclusions. It is an act of trust. When time will pass and you'll draw the conclusions, maybe I will speak, but I'd like that you do this job in a professional way." What actions have we seen in the Church since this testimony came out? Robert Royal.
Well, I'm sad to say virtually nothing. We have specific documents that Vigano points to and says, you can find them either in the nunciature here in Washington or in various offices in Rome. And we have not seen anything in 1 year. The new rules that the Pope has put in place, there's a new document that came out in this past May called Vox Estis Lux Mundi. It's the rules for how bishops are to deal with the cases of abuse, say that you're supposed to report this immediately to Rome. Rome is in 30 days supposed to tell you how to handle this. You were supposed to complete the investigation in 90 days, then it goes back to Rome. Well, I mean, we've had an entire year, and virtually nothing has come out of this. Now, sad to say, on top of the lack of activity inside the church, this very mission that the Holy Father gave to the press has virtually gone without anybody digging into these things. The Washington Post, which usually is not very good on Catholic things, but I'll give them credit for one thing at least. They did an extended interview with Vigano.
Yep, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, but I think only because, you know, McCarrick was the Cardinal Archbishop of the capital city of the world here in Washington. So there was a local interest in that, but have the New York Times, have the major news networks, TV networks, et cetera, dug into this? I've seen virtually nothing.
Father Jerry, did you expect that we'd at least at this point, a year later, see a summation of the Vatican findings, at least related to the Vigano case? I mean, 80 bishops called for an investigation of the charges made by Vigano.
I took the Vatican at its word because the press office did say last October that they were going to study the relevant files and that they would release the findings of that. In the actual press statement, it kind of intimated that they'd already seen significant amount of material because they said some of the decisions that were made back in the days ago, the past months or past years, would not be the same kind of decisions that they would make now. So it's obvious they knew what they had there. There's a finite number of documents. Vigano said that there's a file, you know, this thick over at the Congregation for Bishops. Right now, the only thing we know is stuff that's been leaked by Monsignor Figueiredo. We know that there are reports related to what has been said in different lawsuits to verify that Cardinal Wuerl, in fact, knew about McCarrick a lot sooner than he admitted. We know a lot of things from other sources, but the Holy See, quite frankly, this is foot-dragging, and that is not consistent with the thing that they said they would do, which is report to the people of God what happened.
Is this a kill-the-clock strategy, Bob Royal?
Well, I mean, we can't really tell the motives of people what they're doing, but it certainly is the kind of stalling and, you know, let news cycles go by and then things disappear, as we know. Now, I do recall, I just remembered one other instance in which the press, there were 3 women who were pushing very hard at the summit on sexual abuse back in February. They were pushing, there was a final panel with Cardinal Supich and Archbishop Scicluna from Malta, and they said to these guys who were, you know, very much involved in this the abuse situation, they said, "Is there going to be a report with all these documents? We've been promised all this." And Scicluna, rather pathetically, I'm sorry to say, said, "Well, we've been told there is one." And that was already 6 or 8 months after the promise. So there's been no activity. We would think that if it was at all feasible that these things could be produced at this point, because there can't be all that many. Even if there is a thick file, the way that Vigano said on McCarrick, well, the relevant documents could be easy to find and put together.
And Vigano, in his various testimonies, say explicitly these files can be found at the nunciature in New Orleans or in United States, at the nunciature here, at the nunciature there, at the congregation and dicastery here. Not New Orleans. I had a little flashback to home. But he did indicate where you could find this information. And thus far, we've seen nothing. Nothing official, anyway. Now, Pope Francis, in a May 2019 interview with a Mexican journalist, said the following: "I didn't know anything." Now, this is about the McCarrick situation. "I didn't know anything, nothing regarding McCarrick, the Vigano case. I saw it. I hadn't read the whole letter. I saw a little, and I already knew what it was. And I made the choice. I trust the honesty of journalists. And I said to them, look, here you have everything. Study it and draw your conclusions." And that's what you did, because you did the work. That was great. And I was very careful to say things weren't there, but then 3 or 4 months later, a judge in Milan said them when he was convicted. Now, what he's talking about there is a family squabble over money in which the Pope claims Vigano was convicted. He later said, "I kept quiet. Why should I make it worse? Let the journalists find out." And you found it. You found that whole world. It was a silence of trust towards you. The result was good. It was better than if I had started to explain, to defend myself, end quote. Pope Francis, it seems to suggest there that Archbishop Vigano has been exposed as unreliable because of this legal conflict with his brother that was settled in a Milan court. Your thoughts, Father Jerry?
Well, I'll tell you, Raymond, what the Pope said that he knew nothing, he also said to that interviewer that he couldn't remember if Archbishop Vigano had told him about McCarrick. So it's a very confusing answer. As regards the character of Vigano, it has not been impugned. Family squabbles over inheritances and property, that's very common, and that has nothing to do with what Vigano was talking about in the Vatican. Now, we should remember also that the American diocese where McCarrick had worked were also asked to make a report. We haven't seen those reports.
Oh, good point.
Everything points in the direction that Vigano's charges were taken seriously immediately by the people who knew they had to come up with an answer. And then whoever makes the decision about publishing it has said no. We know that Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, said in the month of May of this year that the report was still in preparation. Well, you know, that is not a satisfactory answer to what the people of God want to know. How did this happen that a man who had been reported to the Vatican for various malefactions and turpitudes was allowed to function at the highest levels for so long? This needs to be answered because it concerns the good of the Church.
Right. Bob, will we ever see a thorough investigation of these Vigano charges? Where are these nuncio files? I mean, prove him wrong. He's told you, here's where they are. Prove him wrong, I say.
Yeah, I think what we've seen is a lot of attempts at character assassination. And I'm sorry to say, I think the Holy Father engaged in that case. It's just a diversionary tactic. In fact, it had nothing to do, as Father said, with his credibility in terms of the McCarrick charges. Right. Look, I think we can already see at this point, it's 1 year. And if we begin to establish the paper trail, I think it will go all the way to the highest levels in the Vatican, which means it's very unlikely that the very people who are producing this report are actually going to make it clear that they were involved in it. I think this is an awful thing here in the United States. I think the one sore spot that Catholics simply cannot get beyond, I think over the longer term, the abuse crisis with priests will kind of work itself out, because actually there's a small percentage of priests who are involved in that. But to have the people that we have the greatest trust in, starting with the Pope and the Curia in Rome, to be unwilling to produce a simple report about what actually happened, some of which goes back before Pope Francis was Pope.
Right.
It's not entirely placed on him, but there are some things that Vigano rightly pointed to that seem to establish a network. And I think there's a network both there in Rome and a network here in Washington, because as we've seen, this McCarrick revelation brought down Cardinal Wuerl. It involved Bishop Bransfield.
Monsignor Rossi here
Immaculate
at the
Conception Shrine here in Washington, D.C. Kevin Farrell, who's now a cardinal in Rome. There's just a large number of people who seem to be players in this drama. So are these people going to come forward with material that actually incriminate them? I don't think that's going to happen.
Wow. Father Jerry, I want to talk about this. This past May, Monsignor Anthony Figueredo, you mentioned it earlier, who served as McCarrick's secretary soon after his ordination. He was ordained by McCarrick, in fact, from 1994 to 1995. And they spent most of the next 25 years in Rome acting as McCarrick's assistant. He came out with a report of correspondence from McCarrick proving that there were indeed sanctions placed on the former cardinal. Now, this was a huge point of controversy. People saying there were no sanctions, it never existed, it wasn't formal. McCarrick was apparently told in 2008 by Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, according to the emails that Figueredo shared, then the prefect of bishops. He told McCarrick to move out of the seminary where he lived into retirement, not to travel to Rome, and not to accept any speaking engagements or public appearances. Okay? Now, this seems to corroborate that what Vigano alleges was true, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. The Figueredo material is devastating for those who claim, as Cardinal Ouellet did, that there were no sanctions. There were provisions. He used kind of nitpicking language, to quote Archbishop Vigano's critique of Ouellette's letter, in which he claimed that there were no sanctions, therefore they couldn't be withdrawn. It also, the Figueiredo report refers to letters in which this matter was discussed, so there is written testimony about this. We also have to remember that Cardinal Wuerl at the time said he knew nothing about depredations until they were revealed, in the New York Times.
Right.
He said, his spokesman said the cardinal had nothing to do with McCarrick moving into a parish. Well, McCarrick himself in one of the emails says that, in fact, Cardinal Wuerl was helping him to find a parish to live in. There's so many things that are being revealed from the outside. I don't think the Vatican understands the power that is exercised by people with information that they have no control over. Let's take James Grind, for instance. He is the victim who came forward in the New York Times last July, identifying that McCarrick had abused him since he was 11 years old. This man had been baptized by McCarrick, the first child he ever baptized. Well, James Grind has now filed a civil lawsuit in New York, and the Archdiocese of New York is one of the people that they're suing. Grind's lawyers now have the power through that lawsuit to subpoena, to gain access through discovery to the files of the Archdiocese on McCarrick. A lot's going to come out. Why are we waiting to put this stuff out when only the lawyers or the police show up? This is not the way it should be done in the Church. We should be open, honest, and if people's reputations are damaged because of their actions, well, that's on them, not on the people who reveal it.
I think people just imagine, in the Vatican and in places of power here in the United States, that the Catholic people will eventually forget, and the media have other things on their plate, and they're just going to move on. And so, therefore, we'll never know the truth about these things. I think that's a major error. And in McCarrick's case, he was not only were sanctions placed upon him, he defied those sanctions, continued traveling to Rome, and then he even had a hand in this Vatican-China accord. How did McCarrick escape punishment for so long when so many knew of his misdeeds, Bob?
Yeah, it's puzzling because I think that Figueiredo makes it as clear as it can possibly be when he lays out those specific things, and he says that letter is either in the nunciature or maybe even in the Archdiocese of Washington, and McCarrick says, I shared this letter with Cardinal Wuerl. So, I mean, this is very specific. This is not just a vague charge that's going on. Look, there were reports as early as 2000 and 2005 that were sent to the Vatican about McCarrick. I mean, these are in the John Paul II days, so there were people already at that point who were not interested in looking too closely into this. We know that Pope Benedict was able to impose these sanctions, and there's been a debate about were these formal,
And Ed Penton had the report that a source told him the Pope doesn't quite remember the nature of the sanctions. He remembers imposing them, but not under what.
But they were there, and people clearly knew what they were, and yet McCarrick was able to go on, and then on top of it, it seems like once Pope Francis was elected, he became even more active than he had been in the past. He'd been traveling around meeting with the King of Morocco and the King of Jordan and whatnot, and God only knows what he was doing while he was doing this traveling. I don't think it was tourism. I think that there was something, there was some plan. And then he introduced himself into the Chinese negotiations. I mean, there are letters, communications that I think Figueiredo put out that he said, I will go to see Cardinal Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, as I'm going to enter into the process of figuring out what's going to happen in China. So he was quite influential, and who knows what else he was doing along the way. But look, it's quite easy to trace these things. How is it possible that people see him traveling from one place to another? He's been told that this should not happen, and no one looks at it.
Yeah, Father Jerry, there are many in the Catholic media universe, and it's a small group of people, but they are attempting to say, look, Vigano is a partisan. He's a guy who's got a chip on his shoulder and a grudge against Pope Francis. He doesn't like Pope Francis. But even in his own testimony, he says, if the facts that come out will inevitably hit John Paul and Benedict, as Bob just said, but let them all come out. The people are entitled to know this. Your take on the politicization of what should be a unified front among the Catholic people, at least, to get answers, no matter whose bull gets gored in this thing.
Well, the sexual abuse of minors was one of the few areas in which both Catholic left and right were in agreement that they had to compel the bishops and force the Holy See through adverse publicity to take steps. And if you trace the history of how everything has gone down since the revelations concerning cardinal law in the Archdiocese of Boston, all those many years, essentially action was only taken after adverse publicity. There was no proactive strategy by the Holy See beginning in 2002 to root out the sexual abuse by priests and to uncover bishops who have been protecting those malefactor priests. Now the stage has been set when Vigano said not only did this include cardinals and bishops protecting, but even the Pope himself, and there's just a conflict of testimony. Vigano says the Pope knew about it from me in 2013. He only revealed that in 2018. He held on to that information for 5 years. He only revealed it when the McCarrick situation became public, and then it became obvious to the people of God. Now, wait a minute. What happened during all those years? How did McCarrick get away with it? And Vigano's answer is, unfortunately, he was protected by people in high places. So for the Catholic left, essentially, the enemies of Vigano, to impugn him as being basically a backstabbing, disappointed man, wanted to be a cardinal, never made it, therefore he's letting out fury, that's all what we would say is just sort of like noise. It has nothing to do with reality. Vigano is an honorable man. I consider him to be someone who basically put his life on the line to say corruption in the church needs to be dealt with. And if the Pope can contradict through evidence and witnesses the claims of Vigano, then that's fine, then I'll support the Pope. But this idea that I'm not going to say anything, and then I'll talk to a Mexican journalist and say, I already said I knew nothing, when he had never said that before, and then he says, I can't remember what Vigano told me. This is no way to answer what are legitimate questions. Imagine if a bishop in his diocese pulled this and said to the Pope, I'm not going to say anything about an incident in my diocese, and then months later, well, I already denied it, so let's just move on. That's not how you do things in life.
No. This brings up a very good point. Bob, I want to ask you about this. What provoked Vigano to write this? I mean, he answers this in several of his testimonies, but all this time later, here's a man who's essentially on the run. He's hiding out somewhere. He can't show his face in Rome. But it's interesting that there is no process against him. No one's investigating Vigano or trying to remove him from the clerical state. There is an interesting stalemate here between accused and accuser.
Yeah, I think there's a very heartfelt core to that first testimony of Vigano. I went back and read that and the other statements that he brought out right at the beginning, and you can see that there's something that has really hit him deeply. And he doesn't try to defend himself too much, other than against, mistaken characterizations of what he's charged. Although at one point he says that it's true that I've revealed some things that were part of the pontifical secret, that he's sworn not to reveal certain things for the good of the church. But he says that does not mean that I am to hide things that are criminal, that actually harm other people or harm the good name of the church. So I have to do something at this point. Now, of course, the Vigano revelations occurred in mid-2018. Shortly thereafter, our American bishops, to their credit, asked for an apostolic visitation here in the United States to investigate what happened, how did this thing occur, and Rome said no. Rome said absolutely no, right there at the beginning. So he may have seen sort of the 1-2 punch, that there was the revelation, Rome had kind of made a statement that it wasn't going to do anything in, I think it was July of 2018, and while the Holy Father was in Dublin, I was there for that World Meeting on Families in 2018, toward the end of August, this date. That's when the Vigano testimony came out. So he probably had been mulling this over as these 2 or 3 things began to happen, and then just decided now is the time where we have to do something about what looks like a network of evil.
Father Jerry, another element of this I want to discuss before we move off of the McCarrick situation. He was dismissed from the clerical state definitively by the Pope. Now, might the Vatican have been afraid that in that due process, other names, other charges might have tumbled out? Is McCarrick sort of the Jeffrey Epstein of the Vatican at this point?
I don't think so. Now, I will note that McCarrick's trial was not a public trial. There was no account given of the testimony of the witnesses who were called. And that, I believe, is a problem with the way church tribunals are handling this matter. It does nothing for the public good not to understand that justice is being done in a way that is thorough and that all those involved are being given an opportunity to defend themselves, certainly, but also that the evidence presented, in fact, merits serious consideration. It would be very worthwhile to know what documents and witnesses were employed by the tribunal to convict McCarrick. Yeah. So that is something. Now, you know, the broader perspective here is that McCarrick did tremendous damage to numerous individuals whose faith was damaged, if not, you know, destroyed in the sense of becoming non-operative in their lives. He used tremendous monetary damages to the Catholic Church, both in the past and looking forward. Why is it that he is being given free housing in a monastery in Kansas? He hasn't been compelled by the Vatican to give any monetary compensation to his victims. He has not been told to repent. I mean, one of the corporal works of mercy is to rebuke a sinner. Now, we've convicted him as a criminal, but as a sinner, he needs to be called out and said, you can't live as a retired ex-cardinal at the church's expense without being called to task in front of the church. Because we need to be serious here. Sin is the enemy of salvation. And we need to tell people those who commit grievous public sin and hurt people need to repent in a public way. That I would be much more satisfied if that had happened.
I want to point something else out in the Vigano testimony, and this really cuts across his various releases over the last year. And he points to a much larger problem beyond McCarrick. He points to a cover-up of abuse by church officials, and he claims that there are networks present in the church. Here's the quote: "Corruption in the misuse of the church's resources and of the offerings of the faithful must be fought against. The seriousness of homosexual behavior must be denounced. The homosexual networks present in the church must be eradicated. These homosexual networks, which are now widespread in many dioceses, seminaries, religious orders, etc., act under the concealment of secrecy and lies with the power of octopus tentacles and strangle innocent victims and priestly vocations and are strangling the entire church." What's been the reaction to this challenge, if you will, by Vigano?
Well, if you mean the response inside Rome itself,
inside the church and
I think we've seen virtually nothing. I mean, there hasn't even been a response to deny what he's put out there. It's just ignored as if it didn't even happen. Right. And we know, I don't want to repeat myself, but we know from what's happened here in Washington, D.C., where we have a strong spotlight that was shown on a whole network of very highly placed people in this one city, that there seemed to be mutual back scratching. Suddenly people can't remember things, even though evidence shows subsequently that in fact they knew about certain things. So the kind of network that he's talked about as operating, I think, does more damage than anything else. I mean, if you find that a priest in a particular parish has done something, well, sure, that's awful and it shakes the faith of people, and especially now because there's been a series of these things happening, that has some problems with the church. I think an awful lot of people in the United States right now feel that Rome itself is not helping us with these difficulties. And until that, in some sense, is, whether it's during this papacy or in subsequent papacies, until that problem is dealt with in Rome, there's going to be a fundamental lack of faith in the very people who are supposed to be leading our church. And I think that if the leadership in Rome wants the best thing for the church, not only in the United States, but worldwide, there has to be a fundamental change about this apparent network of people. And it's not only about the sexual matters. There seem to be financial, there's an intertwining of financial corruption as well, as we want.
No, they usually go hand. The sexual corruption and the financial corruption go hand in hand, usually. Now, Father Jerry, Vigano also, in his one of his testimonies, he makes the case that when he presented Pope Francis with his take on McCarrick, that it was sort of brushed aside. And he says, when he clarifies, I think it's in the second testimony, that the Pope was willing to look the other way because at that time he thought, and even Vigano thought, they were only talking about acting out with adults So, acting out with other men, and that somehow that was okay as long as it wasn't minors. But when the charges of minor abuse came forward, then, the alarms started going off in New York and other places in Newark. Your thought on how much that informs this laissez-faire attitude in Rome that really persists till today. Many of these Vatican officials, many people working in the dicasteries, they have very checkered pasts and relationships as nuncios and working in nunciatures around the world that it would seem to run afoul of their vows, whether straight or homosexual.
No, it's very true, Raymond. In fact, that is one of the frustrating things that the people of God have seen over the past number of years, that priests who commit grave immorality, sexual immorality, only were being processed for removal from the priesthood if the victim was under 18 years of age, as if homosexual or heterosexual activity by a priest with older people was okay. I mean, let's go to the case of Zanchetta, the bishop in Argentina, the personal friend of the Pope. The Pope got a picture of this man that was a selfie of him naked that was absolutely disgusting. And when he called Zanchetta in to talk about it, Zanchetta said, well, my phone was hacked. And the Pope said, well, I believed it. Now, wait a minute. This was an immorality with a series of other pictures involving homosexual activity. And, as far as we know, there was no professional forensic examination of that telephone to find out if the hacking was true. Zanchetta then continued in that diocese for a few more years. It was only when the seminarians came forward to bring accounts of what was happening that suddenly he was removed. But by the way, he wasn't removed and then immediately put under a canonical process. He was given a job in the Vatican created for him. And when did his canonical process finally be announced by the Holy See? After it hit the newspapers.
Right.
So we have a reactive mode here, which is basically there's no problem unless people identify it from the outside. We got a problem in the church for an immoral clergy celebrating the sacraments in an unworthy manner while living a double life. This shouldn't be. And the Vatican knows plenty of cases. They've shown that over history. And basically, only when it hits the media do we find out.
Yeah. In June of this year, Vigano gave an extended interview in the Washington Post. And in an unpublished portion, which we actually covered and revealed bits of on this show, he alleged abuse of a minor in the walls of the Vatican itself at the pre-seminary Pius X. Now, the investigation, according to Vigano, was shut down. The whistleblower was removed from the seminary, and the accused was ordained. Now, what is the status of this situation now? There was supposedly an investigation in 2017, but it was shut down by the officials in charge.
The very people who are supposed to be the watchmen, or who are supposed to be the adults in the room that make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen. I mean, look, there are going to be moral breakdowns in the world, and we simply have to be aware that it's a sinful world, and that things like this are going to come forward. But the Catholic people see this. Insofar as those who pay attention to such things, they see something happening, again, right inside the walls of the Vatican. And it just disappears. And it looks like what politicians do when they stonewall and they assume that a couple of news cycles will go by, and then people just forget about it. Well, people don't forget about it, particularly because there's been a sort of a series of things that seem to set up a pattern that it would not be wrong to conclude that no one wants to deal with this problem at the level that it has to be dealt with.
Well, look, the last round of the sexual abuse crisis was minors. This round tends to be seminarians and adults. I mean, it's a different wave, not to take away from the minors who were abused. And let me tell you, to my mind, to my eye, having spoken to some of these survivors, there is nothing worse. It strips them of their faith, their desire to live. I mean, it wounds them in such deep ways. And the fact that you do it with the vestige and the seeming imprimatur of the church, it only fouls and doubles the crime, to my mind. But I think we need to now look at what's happening in these seminaries, in the halls of power within the church, both nationally and internationally. There's another charge, and again, my feeling with Vigano is this. If this is a lie, then let's go out and disprove it, shoot holes in the story, and wipe this thing away. Wipe it away. But people can't seem to do that. Edgar Peña Parra is mentioned in the most recent interview by Vigano. Now, he is the substituto at the Secretariat of State, the number 2. He's accused of abuse of minors and possible criminal activity, Vigano claims. He also claims that the Secretary of State, Parolin, knew of all of this. Father Jerry, doesn't the Church have an obligation to clear the good name of both Parolin as well as his number 2 at the Secretary of State if there's nothing there? But so far, no reaction, like nothing happened.
Yes, well, this is, again, the unfortunate pattern that things hit the media and then the Vatican doesn't always respond to them. In the case of Peña Parra, he was made Secretary, Substituto, which is the number 3 in the Vatican power structure, at the suggestion of Cardinal Maradiaga, because Peña Parra had been a diplomat in Honduras, where Maradiaga is from. Maradiaga is the right-hand man of the Pope.
Right.
So what we're seeing here is a group that promotes their friends, and when the friends are accused of serious malefactions, crimes, horrendous immoral activity, nothing happens unless pressure keeps mounting. Now, this man's position is so influential in the Vatican that it's in their definite interest to clear his name and disprove the charges. Vigano goes into significant detail about how many times that this was reported to the Holy See in the form of naming people involved, the nuncio in Venezuela. He talks about documents. He talks about things that are easily accessible to people in the Holy See. It really is intolerable. I mean, if you imagine corporate America or the academic world, the number 3 official in a company or a university was accused of all of this, and then the president of the university says nothing. That's impossible. It never would be tolerated.
Right. No, imagine the Secretary of State, having charges like this, and people just look the other way. They don't say anything. The media would be up in arms, rightly. Bob, I have to move on. Do you want to comment on this before we move on?
Yeah, I want to point something out. Yeah. We all remember that famous remark of the Pope's, "Who am I to judge?"
Right.
When he was flying back from Rio de Janeiro after World Youth Day in 2013, I think it was. And he wasn't talking about homosexuality in general.
No.
He was talking about Monsignor Bautista Rica, who had been accused of similar misdeeds in Argentina. And it was rumored that he'd been caught in an elevator with a rent boy in Uruguay and all sorts of things like this. And what he sort of said was, well, if a person has got this disorder and he's seeking God, well, who am I to judge?
Right.
So what seemed to be to the world, to the press, a statement about homosexuality was in fact a way of not looking at a case that probably deserved very strong scrutiny. And Bautista Rica is running the Casa Santa Marta, where the Holy Father lives.
Yeah, this is the house where the cardinals stay when they're there, and the Pope is in the penthouse of
and
that
at the same
building.
time, he too, like Zanchetta, was given a job at OPSA, which is the organization that runs the patrimony of the Holy See. So there's a kind of a pattern here that if we had a serious press that was digging into these things. Now, at that point, I think the press had raised a question that they could have gone on with further and actually maybe gotten something done about that particular case. But like most of these cases, people lose interest, they look into other things, and the world in general tends to forget what's happening.
There's another thing here, and I think we can't lose sight. The Vatican is a court. It is a court, no matter what anybody says. And there's an emperor, and there are courtesans, and there's a system. And when a reporter, even the people sitting at this table and in New York, dare to raise or question these things, you're viewed as somehow anti that court. That's not the case at all. We're asking legitimate questions, which leads and surrounds a culture of predation and cover-up. And no one in their right mind would look past that. It's not that I want to give anybody a hard time or I am out for somebody. That's not, or the Pope, God forbid. That's the last thing that I wish really to be spending my time doing, and I've said this repeatedly on this program. I would much rather talk about great works of literature, art, things that are bubbling, positive, moving, innovative things in the church. But we can't get past this thing that is like a boil in the middle of the organism. And so we're forced to address this. Now, currently in Buffalo, New York, this is happening right now. The dean of seminarians at the seminary there, Stephen Parisi, resigned. And the reason he resigned is he is so deeply upset by the culture of abuse going on there. He's calling for the bishop, Bishop Malone of Buffalo, to resign. He had this to say of his departure.
Continual cover-up by this diocese of sex abuse, abuse of power, abuse of authority, abuse of seminarians, practically hazing of seminarians. If you don't go by what they tell you to do or suggest that you do, you're told that you can be dismissed, you're reminded you can be dismissed for any reason at any time.
Father Jerry, your thoughts on this? I mean, this is shocking, really.
No, the Buffalo situation is very concerning. That diocese has been under accusation now for many months. There was a 60 Minutes story back in the winter where the former lay secretary of Bishop Malone came out and said that there were cover-ups going on. A priest, canon lawyer in that diocese also went on 60 Minutes, said the same thing. There have been a number of revelations that come out. If there's any diocese in the country that needs an immediate outside investigation to either disprove the claims and find in favor of Bishop Malone, or to say, in fact, Bishop Malone has not done a good job there as bishop, this is what should happen right now. The people in Buffalo deserve as much consideration as anybody else in the Catholic Church. And unfortunately, you know, being a small diocese in upstate New York, people might say, well, what does it matter? It matters a lot. Truth and justice is exemplary. If we defend the truth and enforce justice in the church, then everybody is strengthened. If we ignore problems, cover up, lie about it, and I'm not saying Bishop Malone is lying. I haven't studied the matter, but many people out there are saying he's running a bad show out there, bad diocese. Come on, send somebody in there, the Holy See, to look at it and come up with an answer. Raymond, your broader point I like a lot, because what's going on right now, and basically for the last number of years, is anybody who talks about the structural apparatus of cover-up is accused of being anti-church and impugning the good nature of the people in charge. And that's not reality. Whistleblowers and people who demand investigations have the same interests that we're all supposed to have at heart: justice and charity. It is uncharitable to Vigano and the people he claims have been offended by the Holy Father and the other bishops. It's uncharitable to just say, we're not going to answer this. We'll give you a report, and then 10 months later there's no report, and nobody explains why. That's a lack of charity, certainly a lack of justice.
Yeah, and the rush to attempt to subscribe partisan motives to this stuff is really ridiculous. Last time I checked, sex abuse is not a partisan affair. There are people who are conservatives doing it, there are liberals doing it, everybody's doing it, and that's the problem. And it's up to us to call it out. And I loved what this seminarian said. This is Parisi, that seminarian we played you a moment ago from Buffalo. He had this to say of what might be done to fix the situation in Buffalo, and then Robert Royal will react. Watch.
We need change. We need somebody to come in and clean house. We need what the church terms as an apostolic investigation of this diocese. The only way for the church to survive is for good and honest lay people to reclaim their church. And the first step is to stop putting money in the collection basket.
Your thoughts, Robert Royal?
Yeah, I think that what we need to see is the what I call the vector to change. I mean, up until now, a lot of bishops thought that the way that they would get preferment, the way that they would be in favor with Rome, was to keep a lid on things, to make sure that there were no scandals, there was no public investigation into things. I think that the opposite needs to become the case now, that when one of these things crops up, and it's clear that I don't know about the Bishop Malone case either. I haven't studied it either, but that's precisely why we need an outside investigation that's going to determine in a fair way what actually happened, who was wrong, who was right about this, what's true, what's false. But until that vector changes, that bishops and other church leaders come to realize that it's actually a greater peril for you yourself in a position of power not to deal with a situation like this rather than to try to cover it up, I can't see how anything can possibly change.
No.
Now, again, we go back to this idea that our bishops, after the McCarrick revelations, asked for Rome to conduct an apostolic investigation, apostolic visitation here to the United States. I think we're going to find that we need a lot of outside investigations. They may be carried out by secular authorities because of the lack of activity on the part of church leaders.
Well, the lack of confidence in the laity, in these church apparatuses has broken down. I mean, I don't know if an apostolic investigation would cure it, because the files are given to whom? And then what happens? Right. I mean, I think that's where the lay people are. It seems to me...
I would just say this, though, about withholding funds. And I have to say that my wife and I have made some decisions about where we're giving our money in our own diocese at this point. But we want to be careful about this, because the church carries out a lot of functions. And we want to make sure that if you're giving to your diocese or to some agency within the diocese, you want to make sure that that particular agency is, in fact, doing what it has been constituted to do. There may be some dioceses where an out-and-out protest against the bishop is the only way you're going to get his attention. But we want to do this in an intelligent, well-targeted way, and not just kind of flail around with denying monies, denying support, where in fact the church does need to continue to do certain things. I
agree. I think we have to be very prudent about that. Father, do you want to talk at all about this before we move on? And we're almost out of time.
Sure. No, I have to say I agree with this point. The confidence of the American Catholic people cannot be produced overnight by simply saying we're dealing with it and then not telling them what we're doing. The Catholic Church has to reveal in a very clear way how McCarrick's situation was allowed to fester. They have to reveal whether Vigano is telling the truth or not. They have to understand what happened in the Zanchetta matter. They have to understand why is it that we in the United States have this ongoing process where it's lawyers and police and district attorneys who are uncovering facts already known to these bishops, for mostly, sometimes there is new information, but most of these things are in the diocesan files, and they've never been revealed until somebody from the outside comes. Now, this, of course, has to do with what is the mission and purpose of the church. That is the salvation of souls. It's not about keeping buildings open. The buildings are there for the purpose, bring souls to God. We should really have a national movement here of prayer, penance, and a desire for honesty expressed in bishops coming right forthright. And if they've made mistakes, admitting it. If they need to resign, resign. If they don't, tell us what they're going to do in the future to make sure that cover-ups are revealed and that malefactors are not rewarded.
Before I let you both go, what do you make of the Cardinal Pell appeal being dismissed by that 3-judge panel this week? The dissenting judge has said he doubts the credibility of that one witness and questions the lack of corroborating evidence. Your thoughts, Robert Royal?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know the legal system very well, but I've been sort of digging into the technicalities about the Pell case, and it appears that in nowhere else but a very few jurisdictions, and Victoria in Australia happens to be one of them, that the testimony of one accuser can be taken as credible without corroborating physical evidence or other witnesses corroborating this. Usually, it's like in the Bible, right? You need at least two witnesses to attest to something. So unfortunately, on the technicalities, he was found, he was not exonerated. Only that one judge of the 3 was willing to say that there was sufficient doubt. I think it's a horrible situation. It looks very implausible to me that what was charged, there were actually 2 young men who claimed that they'd both been sexually abused simultaneously. Now, I know Pell.
Right after Mass.
Pell is a big guy and he was a rugby player, but 2 young guys being simultaneously abused right after Mass by a cleric in his robes right after Mass when all sorts of people are there in the cathedral. It's very, very unlikely that this is what happened. And yet somehow there was a previous trial, which was a hung jury. It was 10-2 in his favor. Right. Probably in the United States, it would have been dismissed and not retried. But somehow when they came back, I think that the way that evidence was presented was limited, and so they got a jury that actually found him unanimously to be guilty. It's a terrible situation. He's probably going to spend the rest of his life in prison. I think it's a terrible injustice in all likelihood. All we can do is pray for him.
Yeah. Father Jerry, your thoughts as you watch this play out?
Well, there is one more appeal to the High Court there in Australia, and I hope his lawyers are competent and able to, come up with a legal justification for lodging that appeal. I'd also think it would be important to investigate what's behind the charges, and then to verify whether there are any defamation going on against Cardinal Pell. But we have to say this. Confidence in the legal system is going to be based on its rational application of law to fact, and that's up to Pell's lawyers to kind of demonstrate that that hasn't happened here. They weren't able to do it in this three-panel court. Maybe they can do it before the High Court, but yeah, there's certainly enough questions here that demand that the Australian justice system be put to its full test, because a man who claims his innocence vehemently is now sitting in jail, and his appeal is underway.
Yeah. Well, we will leave it there. Thank you both. As always, you can find commentary by Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray at thecatholicthing.org. Father Jerry has a fantastic piece really summarizing the Vigano controversy and the reaction to it. You should give that a look-see. And dive into a great adventure with Will Wilder 3, The Amulet of Power. Will Wilder 3 is at bookstores everywhere, as is the entire rest of the series. You can also get it at the EWTN Religious Catalog. That is all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, you can follow me on Twitter. The links are at raymondarroyo.com. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.